We on, huh?
Are we?
That's what it says.
It still says it's loading. You got that music?
Oh, yeah. It pulled up. This one's called Medicine for the World. Shout out to Basketball Bob. Can you hear it?
Been like that since first day one. This here battle liquid flow to put it all in reverse, like it don't matter control. When I get out this battle,
we'll be live in what, 4 minutes? Or we'll start in 4 minutes, Charlie.
Yeah, 4 minutes. A couple songs on the way.
To a minimum, excess about his venom blood. Recession now that Indian, Agitopian, we here for medicine. The place now known as settlement. Look at us now, it's like a neverland. Still got the medicine for the world, though with all this shifted, don't come settlement. Get to go to the minutes, cop circles the globe. But still here to fix it, not blanket shit down. Like the ones above, this here made to be called that medicine. Medicine for the world, yeah. Medicine for the world. This cop circles the globe. The cost enormous and it like that since day one. Just here battle and blow to put it all in reverse. I get up out of control when I get on this kind of this medicine. It's time circles the globe. The cost enormous enough. Been like that since first day one. This here battle with blow to put it all in reverse. Like it I'm out of control when I'm on this night out. This here simple world. It's time circles the globe. The cost enormous enough. Been like that since first day one. This here battle with blow to put it all in reverse, like it I'm out of control. When I get on this tunnel, medicine for the world, come to still in the earth. So saying this effing world, oh, it's a mess, misunderstood by us originals couldn't get. Peoples that made it work and understand what eternal lifespan of time. Consider what we're in now. I'm just saying we had some good bad for better place. Please adapt for the win. Trace back to when not a sin, just a skin. Not red men, just red blenders in. Just not shipped in, just placed here to wear back some momentum with trash made for inches where we are here, not life inches. We need to be together to the finish from that side for the world. Yeah, for the world. As obstacles and glow, cost enormous enough. In like that first day one. It's the battle and we flow to put it all in reverse. Like it I'm out of control. When I get on this shadow, it's medicine for the world. Let's come circles and glow. It costs enormous enough. Been like that since first day one. It's the battle and we flow to put it all in reverse. Like it I'm out of control. When I get on this shadow, it's just medicine for the world.
Yeah, again, that was from Basketball Bob, Cuddle person up there in Happy Camp. So shout out to you, Basketball Bob. I know it's been a long time coming. I've been talking to you a little bit about putting you on, and glad I finally got to. How we doing on time, Verge?
I'm trying to, we're doing, but I'm trying to get the, I don't know how to,
There's another one. Just let me know when it's time.
Yeah, where I get most of my love. Up first begun. Where all the look up on the rivers just like prayers for us. The only place that holds us up, not like the holder that act like crumbs. Replenish savings of the earth's prize like cravings. Not your birthright, just does no justice for first light as she hurts with each cry. Up here on the res, we surviving, yeah, through each night. Up here on the res, yeah, up on the res, yeah, up on the res, where my people stay strong. Up on the res, where I play most of my fall. Up on the res, yeah, where I get most of my love. Up on the res, yeah, where this had first begun. Up on the res, yeah, where I want. Up on the res, where there's still plenty of us. Up on the res, yeah, where I played most of my ball. Up on the res, yeah, where my people stay strong. Up on the res, yeah.
All right, Charlie, you ready?
Up on the res, yeah, up on the res.
I mean, I just forwarded it. Hopefully she can sign on through my link. But I don't know. We might have to start back over. I sent it. I don't know what happened.
Are you in communication with her right now?
Yeah.
She said she can't get in it.
She didn't get the email.
Can you invite her from the toolbar here?
I don't know. How do you do that?
Does it say invite on the bottom?
No.
Click more. Does it say invite for you?
Yeah.
Because this is the one that we used for the practice session. So I'm sure there we go.
Oh, we got it. Nice. Hello.
Hello.
We
How
made it.
are you? Yes.
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Doing well, thank you.
So maybe we could, before we get started, well, actually we're live right now. So let's just get started. And Charlie will introduce the speaker series, and then I'll lay out a little bit how it's going to go, and then we'll get right into the presentation.
All right, y'all. I hope you guys enjoyed the music for the time being. Thank you for the patience. I think that was a really good opportunity to kind of show just kind of what local artists are up to these days and how much their music can influence and kind of relevant to what we're doing today in our talk. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Moorhead Jr.
Thank you, Charlie. It's a wonderful day here up in Humboldt County where it's sunny. And we are live on Facebook officially. It's been a little bit of a couple setbacks this week, but we got it down. So I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, who is Dr. Tria Blue Wakpa. I met her back when I was living in Berkeley about 7-8 years ago. And since then, she's, developed a really good, positive following and really developed herself into a fine professional. Dr. Tria Blue Wakpa joined the UCLA Department of World Arts and Cultural Dance as an assistant professor of dance studies in 2018. She is a scholar and practitioner of indigenous contemporary dance, North American hand talk, martial arts, and yoga. She's well-versed in indigenous studies and really, at the forefront of a lot of things that are going on in indigenous studies and really working with Native people. And so today she's going to do a presentation. And then after that, we will take questions from the audience, as well as our co-host, Amada Lang, and our host, Charlie, will talk questions. So it'll really just be a dialogue. So welcome, Dr. Tria Blue Wakpa.
Thank you so much for having me. And I have prepared a PowerPoint for today. So if it's okay with you, that's what I was making sure that I can pull it up.
Yep.
And I will go ahead and pull it up now. And hopefully, just let me
There it
know if you
is.
can see that.
Yes.
Okay. And let me see if there's a way to just do the slides.
Perfect.
Okay. So the title of my talk today is Native American Embodiment, Politics and Possibilities. And I wanted to first begin by thanking you all so much for having me. I've been tuning into a lot of the speaker series, and I find a lot of the people who are speaking to be very inspiring, and I've learned a lot from what I've listened to. I'd also like to acknowledge the Fernandeño Tataviam and Gabrieleño Tongva people on whose lands I live and work. And also I know that viewers are joining us from many different places. So I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples on whose land that they are on as well. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the Native people whose expertise, knowledge, and generosity makes it possible for me to make an offering today. And I also think it's important to recognize and acknowledge the times that we are in with COVID-19. And so I think it's really important to recognize the Native people who are also imprisoned on occupied and stolen lands, who are always enduring challenges. But I think especially right now, during this time, they have had, to protect them, from the virus, they have had their Native ceremonies and powwows canceled. And those are within the prisons the state prisons that I work on Lakota lands in South Dakota. And they've also had, visitors prohibited from coming in, and also volunteers. And so I know that those ceremonies and those powwows, those gatherings are very important to them. And, at the two facilities, the adult facilities where I work, the South Dakota State Penitentiary and the South Dakota South Dakota Women's Prison, they've already had cases of COVID-19. And then I wanted to say at the beginning of the presentation before moving forward that I curated a community engaged art show with several community partners. So a lot of the images, which I've explicitly asked for permission to share, a lot of the drawings or all of the drawings that I'm sharing with artist credit are done by Native folks who were incarcerated at the time that they did them or are still incarcerated to this day. One more thing I'd like to acknowledge before I move on with the greatest respect is the passing of Andrea Circlebear of Eagle Butte, South Dakota. She passed away this week at 30 years of age after giving birth on a respirator. And she was convicted of and died for a nonviolent crime. And so my prayers are really with her and her family. And I want to say, that this is why, this is one of the reasons why that I do the research that I do on Native American embodiment in prisons is because of these ongoing injustices of the settler state, which as Circlebear's death shows are urgent and really have these life or death consequences. I wanted to talk a little bit about who I am and how I come to this research. I have mixed ancestry. I'm Filipino, European, and have tribally unenrolled Native ancestries as well. I'm married to Dr. Makablu Wakpa. He's an enrolled citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and I'm the mother of our two children who are ages 2 and 3.5. And so at UCLA, I'm an assistant professor of dance studies in the Department of World Arts and Culture's dance. And my talk today is really at the intersection of Native and dance studies. And so my intention is, rather than going really deeply into any one thing, is to present a few different facets of the work that I'm doing in the way that I understand it, relating to the Two Feathers mission statement around holistic health and community well-being. And in the Q&A, I'd be happy to elaborate further on any items or elements that might be useful to you or the viewers of the community. So just an overview of what I'll be discussing today. I'll define how I'm thinking about embodiment and its relationship to colonization. I'll discuss what the field of dance studies offers that's different from other academic fields. I'll emphasize the importance of enacting community-engaged research and decolonizing methodologies in dance studies, and in particular when writing about Native dance. Highlight some of the vital embodied work that contemporary Native people are doing throughout my presentation. And I want to conclude by illuminating how some Native experts broadly conceive of Native culturally relevant practices in powerful and healing ways. And so I know that we have viewers, or I think that we have viewers today as well, joining us from Race and Yoga, which is a peer-reviewed journal in academia that I co-founded. And so I just want to let them know that if they are watching, I will be making those connections to yoga at the end of the presentation. So my research thinks about dance broadly. It thinks about dance alongside other movement practices, performances. I look at basketball in a boarding school, a former boarding school context, I think about Native martial arts, theatrical productions, yoga, particularly yoga from an intersectional perspective, but also I think the really powerful work that Native people are doing around yoga, and North American hand talk, which is Indigenous Sign Language, or the lingua franca prior to English in this partition of the Turtle Islands known as the US. And just, briefly to give a little bit more of a description there, although I want to acknowledge that I'm using Native American and Indigenous somewhat interchangeably, but of course we understand that tribes are nations, all tribes are diverse. However, North American hand talk was and is a common language that unites different tribes, and people are able to come together and trade and communicate through hand talk. And then just a little bit about me. I didn't, a lot of my interests are very much influenced by my family. I didn't know anything about North American hand talk until my husband Maka introduced me to it. And this is something that he wrote about in his dissertation. And also throughout my childhood, my parents really emphasized the importance of holistic well-being through example and sharing their movement practices with my siblings and me. So that's a picture of my father. I'm the oldest, the tallest one on the left, and those are my two sisters and my brother. We all grew up practicing the martial arts. I have a 3rd degree black belt in my family system. I went on from that, and this is something Dr. Moorhead and I have in common, is I went on from that training in the martial arts to wrestle. I was eventually I earned a became a 2-time women's national championship, and I was a member of the women's world team, which is what they called the Olympic team prior to women's wrestling being in the Olympics. And, my mother was my first yoga teacher as well. So these are all, have inspired, these ways of training and moving have very much inspired the work that I do today. And something that I'm really interested in is also the connections that Indigenous movement practices enact among humans and more than humans. And speaking of this Indigenous speakers series, I want to acknowledge Dr. Kutcher Baldy, because I've seen other people discuss it as other than humans or non-humans, but I really appreciated her saying more than humans, right? So it's not like this otherizing of non-human animals, but like, you know, recognizing them as being, you know, in a respectful, reciprocal, and way, in a way that doesn't otherize them. So I do want to acknowledge that that is something that I learned from her very recently through your speakers series. And so just briefly here, you know, something else I should say too before moving on is a lot of times when people think about Native martial arts, they think about maybe like the US military. And this is work that I'm just, you know, beginning to think through, and is not part of the book project or any articles I'm in progress on at the moment. But Native tribes would have had their, and you know, some still do, I'm sure, have their own martial practices. And Native people are taking this up and revitalizing this in I think, very interesting ways. And if we look at martial arts and Indigenous people worldwide, and dance and Indigenous people worldwide, a lot of more than human animal movements have inspired like those styles or systems of martial arts, or have inspired dances. And so I think those are really exciting and powerful connections. And so that's something I'm thinking more about. So I wanted to define, you know, the term embodiment, which I'd never really thought about too much until graduate school. So I think it's important to define that, and then why it matters. So all of our actions are embodied, although there is a caveat here in that I've been thinking about some of the Native elders who have very long or life sentences, who as a practice of wellness, while they're incarcerated, one elder that I work with, his name is George Bluebird. He's been incarcerated for 36 years, and I'll talk more about him. He has this practice of what he terms drifting, which is where he is able to like daydream and dream and travel beyond the prison walls. So I think there's also ways that we can really nuance this, which might be directions for further research. However, colonization has sought to impose on Native peoples a new relationship to their bodies. And one of the major ways that that colonization does this is through creating this mind-body split, or what we might term Cartesian dualism. And this comes from the French philosopher René Descartes, who says, "I think, therefore I am." So there becomes this false separation of mind and body. And we can really see this in terms such as like mental health, right? Like, how can we isolate the mind from the body, from the spirit? They're all connected. And then in Eurocentric understandings, intelligence is associated with the mind. And the mind is viewed as superior to the body, which is again, a false division. Of course, the mind is part of the body. But I will say terms like embodiment and terms like mental health are very important when we're thinking within and how to challenge these Eurocentric constructs. They do mean something important. So I was thinking a little bit about this. In dance studies, we often talk about Descartes, and I think, therefore I am. So in creating this presentation, I had the chance to think about what Indigenous understandings might do differently. Of course, again, acknowledging that there is a vast diversity among Indigenous peoples. But instead of, I think, therefore I am, it occurred to me that Indigenous understandings might instead construct that as I dance, therefore we are. And so I want to go a little bit more in depth in explaining that. And Indigenous ways of knowing enact holistic understandings of mind, body, and spirit, and the interconnectedness of humans and non-humans, or the term I now prefer, more than humans. Dance, and so I'm not saying, you know, that, I'm saying that dance is thinking, right? I don't want anyone to misunderstand that, but dance is thinking, and it's thinking in a very holistic way, right? It's in part because mind, body, and spirit are inextricable. And a dance is a way of creating and producing knowledge. In many indigenous understandings, we extend beyond humans, more than human animals, air, land, water, heavens, and universe. So when we say I dance, therefore we are, those connections are not only to human relatives, but also to more than human relatives. And the concept of embodiment becomes important within Eurocentric understandings that often overlook the body and its knowledge. So just like mental health, we can critique that term. It is also very important. The term embodiment, we can critique that, but it also is doing particular work, considering that the mind in Eurocentric understandings is created with intelligence and represented as superior. And at the same time, I'll say that embodiment is a very broad term. So I try to be specific, but for the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to talk about why that term is useful and define it. Okay, I'm gonna have to move your up so I can't read the title. Okay, so epistemologies underlie embodiment. So epistemologies is just a way of saying ways of knowing. So ways of knowing underlie embodiment. And embodied, and that means that embodied practices are political. They're never neutral, they're political. And because I have this photo credit by Dr. Michael D'Angeli, she is an amazing Native Alaskan woman who is a dancer, practitioner, and also a scholar. And she was doing work on this far before me, and I've learned a lot from her work. And I would recommend, she has a dissertation titled Dancing Sovereignty that people might be interested in checking out to learn more about this. So I'm gonna go ahead and read this quote. This is from a presentation I gave a few years back, I think maybe like 2015. The Indian dances, though not immoral themselves, are, in my opinion, the greatest obstacle in the way of civilizing and Christianizing these people. That means Lakota people. They are and remain the living tradition, keeping alive the old habits. The custom of giving away all kinds of property in the way of presents exercises its tyrannical force mainly on account of the publicity at dances. Especially the 4th of July celebration, as it was kept for the last 5 years, has resulted more in a revival of the old Indian habits than in a teaching of patriotism, that's US patriotism, as was intended. Okay, so I'm going to discuss that quote a little bit through articulating the power and possibilities of Native dance and other embodied practices. So as that excerpt shows us, embodied practices can have multiple and contradictory meanings. So this is one of the ways that there can be a lot of subversion, right? Resisting or challenging practices, challenging power through embodied practices. And so they can have multiple and contradictory meanings, and they've been leveraged for a variety of purposes. So what that excerpt shows us is that, the missionaries and other officials they had in mind that they were going to have these 4th of July celebrations, and that, this was going to help them perpetuate colonization and to instill US patriotism in the people, in the Lakota people. However, we can also see from the quote that Lakota people were actually using these opportunities to perpetuate and innovate their Native practices, worldviews, and sovereignties. And so these embodied practices are incredibly political, incredibly powerful, and have a lot of potential. And so this next point, US leveraging and prohibition of Native forms of indigenous embodiment illustrate the power of indigenous movement practices. So I know we have many viewers who are familiar with it. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act, very late, 1978, which arises and legally allows Native people to engage in their ceremonial practices. But that comes very late, and it shows how the power of these practices that the colonizer even recognized. Now, I will say, at the same time, these practices are not always prohibited. So they're sometimes leveraged in what a scholar called Goffman refers to as institutional shows. So there is a way, for instance, that the prison powwows at the South Dakota State Penitentiary and the women's prison reflect well on the institution, right? Or that these basketball games, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, they also reflect well on the boarding school, right? So they're being leveraged for different ways. At the same time, Native young people, which is something that I argue in my book project, Native young people are leveraging in subversive ways these same embodied practices to perpetuate and innovate their Native identities in these, very oppressive environments. So the written realm can attempt to fix the meaning of embodied practices. And what I mean there is because embodied practices are fluid and they can mean many different things. I see boarding school articles or narratives about prison powwows that try to say this is what this particular thing means, right? And if we're looking at boarding school articles, often, but not always, sometimes that subversion slips into the boarding school newspaper, but often it's in a way that that positively portrays the institution. So I highlighted these or underscored these because I think it's really important in terms of like Native people and practices to emphasize these. Native embodiment is inextricable from Native lands and more than human relatives. And Native embodiment is inextricable from Native sovereignty. Sovereignty is embodied. And Native practices enact worldviews, Native worldviews, including Native relationships to land. So one of the ways that you can see that, examples of that might be, the harvesting of particular plant relatives in order to create regalia, or as far as Native martial arts goes, using using the plant life or I don't like the term resources, but using the plant life that is on those particular lands to create weapons, right? So that influences the regalia, the dances, and other practices such as martial arts. And I will also say that, again, Indigenous people worldwide have observed animal movements as a way to, and animal knowledge, the knowledge in that, as a way to train their bodies and to develop these movement practices. Okay. So one way that we put this into practice was through, I invited Tina and Jessa Calderon, who are esteemed Tongva and Chumash artists, performers, and dancers, to come to UCLA and to do 4 workshops with students, which we opened up to the public around first contextualizing, Tongva history and resilience and ongoing struggles, but also offering students and people from the community an opportunity to learn about these embodied modes. And that's something, thinking about relationship building with the people whose land that I'm living and working, and as an assistant professor who does have some privilege in terms of bridging the academy and communities, this is, I thought that this was important, and we have plans to continue working together in respectful and mutually beneficial ways. And so one thing I did have students do after these workshops was write reflection papers, and it was very, and we actually shared the reflection papers that they wrote with the students' permission with Tina and Jessa Calderon. And you could clearly see like how powerful it was to bring them into the classroom. And it was a very transformative experience for, you know, a lot of us. Okay, so it's a little tricky because I can see you all, but then I can't see the slide. So what is dance studies and why does it matter? So a little bit about dance studies. Dance studies, in a way, like Native and Indigenous studies, is a marginalized field within the academy. From the 1980s to 2000s is a pivotal time for the field. And I'm drawing here from Janet O'Shea's Roots and Roots of Dance Studies. She's an associate professor in our department at UCLA. And she discusses the ways that dance emerges out of anthropology, dance criticism, philosophy, and historical studies. But of course, it is also influenced as well by Indigenous studies, ethnic studies, and ethnic studies. A foundational understanding of dance studies, much like Native studies, is that our bodies carry, create, and transmit knowledge, and knowledge is theory. And I'm really interested in thinking about like, how do we demystify, or how do we, you know, for everyone, how do we make theory accessible? And I have a friend and colleague at the University of Utah, Kate Mattingly, who's doing a lot of really great work there, critiquing whiteness in dance studies and whiteness in the academy, and also thinking about the power of Indigenous epistemologies and practices and being in, you know, good relationship with Indigenous people. The way that she explains this is theory is the how and why, and we move within these interlocking structures of power. So you can take anything, you know, you can take, we recently read Foucault, you could take handwriting and think about what is the how and why, what are the politics behind that, right? Or native dance or martial arts. And so when you're thinking about the how and why, you also not only thinking about the practice, right? The practice doesn't exist in isolation, but you think about the setting, the lands on which it is occurring. Something that Native and dance studies have in common is they both value embodied practices, which opens up the possibility to understand embodied epistemologies. So if you don't value embodied practices, then you won't be engaging or thinking about the knowledge that embodied epistemologies have. And Native epistemologies underlie Native movement practices. So we had that quote earlier, for instance, and it was talking about the Lakota people continuing to do the giveaways at the dances. Well, what underlies that is, you know, a key Lakota value, which is generosity, right? Okay, so one of the methods and ways that one of the primary methods and ways that dance studies makes an intervention is through choreographic analysis. And so what a choreographic analysis is it's a close reading of bodies and movements, and a primary methodology in dance studies. So the best way I think that I can describe this, and probably the most accessible way, is a lot of us have had the experience of writing an English paper or writing about a poem, right? And we look really closely at the words, you know, even at a word level. What is the denotation of the word? What are the various meanings that the word has? What are the possible ways that we can interpret this line break in poetry? How does it offer multiple meanings? And so that's the same thing with what we're doing in dance studies. So dance studies is different from other fields. A lot of fields, I heard one person say this one time and it stuck with me, is that I was writing about dance without really writing about dance. And so in dance studies, we realized in dance studies, a major methodology is writing about dance by doing sort of a close analysis, describing the movements and what knowledge do we see in those movements and the tensions in the body, etc. And I can go more into that if people would like examples. And in fact, I will go a little bit more into that. So dance studies challenges Eurocentric understandings of the mind as separate from and superior to the body. And writing about dance or other movement practices is a way that we can unearth knowledge which other academic fields often omit. So again, I don't want to go too far into this, but you know, I have been practicing yoga for over 20 years now. And when I was doing a close reading recently of Haley Laughter, who's the Dene yoga practitioner and teacher, who I'll come to at the end of this presentation, writing about that and really has deepened my yoga practice, like thinking through, where is the gaze? You know, does this animal pose really look like this animal? Or can we think about it as looking like other more than human animals? And that really deepens our connection and our understanding of embodied practices. Okay, so this is a paper I've been working on for a while. I don't have it quite right, so I'm still working on it. But it's about Buffalo dance, which I'm not going to show here, but it's a 15-second film that, about 15-second film that you can access on YouTube. It was one of the first films to depict Native people. It was created in Thomas Edison's Black Maria studio, and it features these Lakota performers, Last Horse, Parts His Hair, Coat, Pine, and Strong Talker. And I thought I really wanted to just like say their names and aloud and give them credit for this powerful work that like continues to be very relevant today. And so what I do is I do that sort of close readings of bodies and movements to unearth knowledge, which really has not yet been done, even though this, you know, this film is, you know, a seminal film created in 1894. And the film continues to be misrepresented in scholarship. So I know for like a lot of people who are tuning in, you know, it's no surprise that that scholarship misrepresents Native people and practices, but for some other people that might be a newer idea. And so when I started to look at each of the dancers' movements, it got me to think, oh, okay, so sorry. The way that this is represented, as late as 2012, a cinema scholar says that this is a Buffalo dance, and he doesn't cite anything. But like if you watch the film or even just look at this picture, like they look like chickens and their movements look like chickens. And so what this illustrates is the way that we privilege often the written word and assume that that is correct over the knowledge that the bodies and movements, right? Which is really problematic. And so I started thinking about, you know, chickens, and are there indigenous chickens to Lakota lands? And what do you know? There are prairie chickens, which are literally do a dance. The males literally do a dance. They're and so you can see also, if you watch this film on YouTube, the chicken-like movements. And then, you know, because my husband has written a dissertation on North American hand talk and teaches it to our children, I started, when I watched each one individually, I thought, oh, wow, each one is doing a separate hand talk sign. And so I'm not going to go too, so they're like communicating with us, and people are, you know, overlooking that, and it's really problematic. But this is what dance studies does, is it allows us to kind of unearth that knowledge. And so, you know, the argument is that, you know, together in succession, these signs collectively communicate Lakota masculinity and sovereignty. There is a picture of a prairie chicken who George Bluebird, again, the Lakota elder, that I work with at the South Dakota State Penitentiary, he said that some families would actually study the prairie chicken and make their camps nearby the prairie chicken. So what that, the reason I bring in that buffalo dance film and the paper I'm writing about it is because I think it's a really good example of the ways that that it's really important to engage community and use decolonizing methodologies. So the misrepresentations of buffalo dance in scholarship shows, okay, I'm gonna say one more thing, which is the reason it's titled Buffalo Dance is because they were performers in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which I think I left out, and it's actually an Omaha dance. So what it shows is the ongoing imposition of a Eurocentric lens when writing about Native people and practices, the power of a choreographic analysis, the necessity of community engagement, recognizing Native people as experts and consulting with them. And it's particularly vital when writing about Native dance, which is sacred knowledge. And this, I really like this term, which actually Dr. Moorhead, I heard on one of your podcasts when I was preparing for this presentation. So I wanted to also credit you for that. Now, one thing I also want to acknowledge is that because, well, let me read the quote first. Traditional, this is from Tara Browner's Heartbeat of the People. She's also a UCLA professor of ethnomusicology and American Indian Studies. And she says, traditional dance and music, even when performed at large, competitive powwows and for non-Indian audiences can still exist within the realm of the spiritual and sacred. And so that's why I think it's really important to be consulting with and engaging with Native communities, is because, you know, another Eurocentric misunderstanding is that, like, just because you have the knowledge, it means that you should publish it, right? Or that it's your individual knowledge, which it's not. And so, and Native peoples, Indigenous peoples have different understandings around collective knowledge and different protocols, which are tribally specific. And so that's why community engagement is so important, because you may say, oh, I'd really like to write about this. And someone says to you, no, that's not something you should be writing about. And then it's important to listen to that and not do so. So this is George Bluebird, who is the Lakota elder that I work with, who has been incarcerated for, again, 36 years at the South Dakota State Penitentiary. He's a really incredible person. He's fluent in Lakota, and he's very knowledgeable about Lakota history, culture, and practices. And one thing that's really interesting too is that at the South Dakota State Penitentiary and also at the South Dakota Women's Prison, Native people who are incarcerated have organized there. And so they have their own nonprofits. And currently he's the president of the Native American Council of Tribes. And they do really important work both within and beyond the prison. And so this was something that he wrote to me when I started asking about prairie chickens. And he says, I like to share his words in public presentations. And I also am continually grappling with the tension that I have the privilege to share these words when a Lakota elder with vast cultural knowledge, fluent in the language, is locked up. So this is a tension that I continually grapple with. So he says, Tria, there was a time when our Lakota tribes were in complete harmony with the creatures of the lands and the birds that fly in the skies. We spoke with them in our languages and they talked with us. Our sacred customs and traditional ceremonies were a valuable part of our existence together. We took care of each other. Our spirituality with our circle depended on our right to imitate our dance movements and to share our voices. We did these out of righteousness and confidence. Our dependence on each other was a natural way of survival. Please add the above statement to your writing. It clarifies everything. And I also want to say there that through the process, I was writing the Buffalo paper. I began writing the Buffalo Dance paper in 2017. And that was even before I attended my first prison powwow at the South Dakota State Penitentiary. And so I met Mr. Bluebird there. And it was through the process of writing the paper and asking about it, and through this community engagement, that I realized I was asking him about the different names, because the performers they're sometimes referred to as Lakota. The Library of Congress has them listed only as Dakota. And so I was asking him about these names and where these names might originate. And he called me about a week later and he said to me, why were you asking about Parts' hair? And I said, well, because he's one of the performers in the film I'm writing about that I was telling you about. And he said, oh, well, that's my great-great-grandfather. And he sent me the genealogy and some family photos. And so it's really, for me, that was a very powerful experience, and to be thinking through the film and the meanings of this film with a direct descendant of one of the performers. So I want to conclude by thinking about what constitutes a Native culturally relevant practice. And just take a little drink of water. So in settler colonial discourses, Native people are often misrepresented as static or extinct, as many of us know. And the idea, I try not to use words like traditional, because there is a way that because of these Eurocentric constructions, that people misunderstand that traditional dances never change. In fact, dances change every time that they are performed. But why I'm raising this question is based on some of the work that I'm seeing Native people do, powerful work, and the conversations that I'm having with them. And so I'm also considering the ways in which Native people have indigenized culturally relevant, or indigenized practices and made them culturally relevant, right? So an example of this that I think through in the book project is that in the boarding schools, officials often sought to relegate Native curricula to arts, athletics, and recreational activities, right? So it's seen as like not knowledge. This is something that we do in our free time, or this is not necessarily, with art's a little different, but part of the core curriculum that everyone must complete. And so in the Native context, looking at the boarding school archives from the Rosebud Reservation, I look at St. Francis Mission School, it occurred to me that it might be important to make a distinction between culturally themed practices. So the ways that I saw educators introduce Native team names or Native mascots, it seemed to me that the boarding school officials were working to diminish Native sovereignty, right? To relegate it to this other supposedly inferior realm, which of course it's not. Dance studies and Native studies tell us that it's not. But it made me kind of think about the ways that we could think about Native culturally relevant practices in a way that strengthen Native sovereignty, like kind of a broader definition. And so this last point is just emphasizing that, what I've seen through basketball and gardening at a tribal juvenile hall, which is one of my research sites, and also at the boarding school, the ways that Native people really do, they have been making culturally themed curricula culturally relevant. And I think I misspoke there. So I want to say that for sure, the tribal juvenile hall that I work at, they center culturally relevant programming and ceremonies. I'm not saying that it's culturally themed. So this is something I've recently been writing. It's HOZHO Yoga. It's about a 3-minute film, which you can find on YouTube. It features Haley Laughter, who is Dene, and she's also the founder of HOZHO Total Yoga, which is an organization that brings yoga to Native people. And you might be familiar with Haley because she posts these like really stunning photos in healthy active natives for a long time. She was one of the first people within that very large group of what is now over like 70,000 people to post these images and of her doing yoga. And what I think we consider is, and what I think through in this film is that yoga is also an indigenous practice from other lands that originates in other lands, but it's grounded in indigenous ways of knowing, right? So I would, just like Native people are diverse and I would never try to collapse them, but I'm also speaking generally at the same time. Yoga and Dene philosophies illustrate the interconnections among human and non-human persons, such as more than human animals, land, water, sky, and the universe, and the mind, body, spirit, so that holistic connection. And choreographic analysis, so what I do in this paper is Haley, as an expert, is already making those connections between yoga and Dene philosophy. So what I'm able to add to that is a choreographic analysis or a close reading of the practice in this particular context on a movement level. And one thing Haley spoke, I think, really powerfully about is the way that the story is that she was practicing yoga, and a Dene elder saw her practicing yoga, and he told her that actually she was doing back bends. So he was thinking about the spine, and he said to her, you know, the corn is, for audience, the corn is very sacred to Dene. And he was saying that the corn stalk is like the spine and our legs and is grounded in the earth. And then the tassels are like the head. And so from this information that a Dene elder gifted her, Haley created this corn meditation. And in an interview I did with her for our Race and Yoga journal, she speaks really powerfully about offering this to Dene elders who are weavers, and them discussing that through this corn meditation and yoga, it really took them back home to who they are. And so I think there are definitely ways that this is strengthening, you know, a yoga practice can strengthen identity and Native identity and connection. And so to ground that in examples, so it's not like I'm just making that claim, this is an interview I recently did with Haley, and she says, HOZHO is a Dene philosophy meaning walking in beauty and harmony and well-being. So in equilibrium with our mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being, and the way that we interact with other people, and the way that we define ourselves as Indigenous people, and our connection between Mother Earth and our Creator and the different elements and the universe. In this way, Dene philosophy is pretty much what yogic philosophy is. And here is a quote from BKS Iyengar, who's the late founder and well-respected founder of Iyengar Yoga. And you can see it's not exactly the same, but certainly there are some similarities here. So asanas means poses. Whilst performing asanas, the yogi's body assumes many forms resembling a variety of creatures. His mind is trained not to despise any creature, for he knows that throughout the whole gamut of creation, from the lowliest insect to the most perfect sage, there breathes the same universal spirit, which assumes innumerable forms. And so this was also something I was thinking about in 2011 when I was doing research and thinking about how my research could be reciprocal on the Rosebud Reservation. So I asked the director at that time of the Tribal Juvenile Hall, you know, what I could offer, what could I possibly offer, you know, to be in reciprocal relationship with them. And he said, you know, we'd like we'd like to see some yoga. Why don't you offer yoga at the Tribal Juvenile Hall? So I taught yoga there for about a month I was there, and we separated the boys and girls, probably about 2 classes a day, 5 days a week. And so it was pretty intense for the young people. And I thought that it was very important to honor them at the end of this, month-long session. And so we created this award of excellence. And, namaste in yoga, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, usually say it at the end, and it means like the light in me, or the universal spirit in me, recognizes and honors the universal spirit in you. And, through conversations with people on the reservation, they were saying, that there's some similarities between that and the sacred, Matakiase, which means, we are all related. And, just to talk about, the theory that comes out of like young people. And I think that the theory, like moving with young people, and I'll never forget that a young person that I was teaching yoga to this, one of these summers, when I said to him, this is what namaste means, they replied, it means the light in me recognizes and honors the light in you. And they said, well, what happens if your light is dim? And I thought, wow, like what a way of thinking about and theorizing, the way that, colonization has, impacted this young person. And so I just wanted to end on this quote, which is Haley's words. I can see that I went way over too. I apologize for that. So this is what Haley says. She says, yoga is something that I found to help me heal from my own trauma and understand who I was. My life was not easy. It's not easy. And I was given a rough hand in the beginning. Not as rough as many other people, but still pretty rough. Yoga is where I found my identity, and it's where I found who I was. Yoga brings you back to who you are. So clearly this shows the way that a Native expert and yoga practitioner and teacher is thinking about yoga as a way to strengthen Native identity. And so that is it for my talk today. I did just want to, quickly go through, I'm not going to go through these unless there's interest, but I was listening to the other presentations and really thinking critically about what some of the questions, that might be asked of me. And, so I am prepared to speak some about the community engaged research that I do, how that looks different in dance, and also like allyship. So I encourage people to ask whatever is of interest. I actually can't see if people are commenting or anything right now, as this is my full screen, but those are also some things that I'd be happy to discuss if it's useful. So thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just like, I really feel very, honored that I was asked to do this, and very inspired by the work that you are all doing, like continuing to bring a lot of education and powerful speakers. And so I just feel very honored to be a part of this series and to share some of the work that I've been doing in collaboration with Native people.
Thank you. I really appreciate that presentation. And if you can stop sharing, and then we can get right into the dialogue and asking some questions. How it will work, Tria, is the questions come from the Facebook comment section. So then we'll get it sent to us, and then Charlie will read over it. And so I wanted to, because my colleague Amada had done some research on you, and also has been attentively listening to your presentation. So I wanted to throw it over to her for the first question, and then we'll go from there.
So, hi, my name is Amada again. I have been working with Two Feathers for a little bit and a part of this speaker series, and thank you for giving us an insight on this, because I'm part with recreation administration as my bachelor, so I enjoy just the therapeutic part of recreation as well as what it could bring. And so this was very informal because I've tried yoga and it's been very hard for me because I've been in sport, like kind of faster paced sports, but I've tried yoga and it's definitely brought me down to where I can feel that. But one of my questions is, how have you tied you talked about like yoga, the hand talk, which is also interesting. How have you tied that specifically into your work as a professional with being able to help the Native community in a sense? Because I do inclusive communities as well. And so I could see the Native hand talk being another way that a youth who can't necessarily communicate uses American Sign Language. I can see that as a super useful. So I'm just curious how you apply these all in a sense.
That is a really good question, Amada. Thank you. I think that the way that I usually approach it is, okay, so there are, what we have done is we have offered, so for instance, we usually do not, we usually kind of keep these embodied practices separate a little bit when we're teaching them, right? So I guess that would be like the first thing, but they can be implemented at a lot of different levels and in a lot of different ways. So for instance, my husband, he's done a lot of workshops for Native young people around North American hand talk. And he also offered those at UCLA. And he actually, the way that those workshops kind of look is that, you know, people are not allowed, people can speak because a lot of times, well, one thing about North American hand talk is people tend to associate it with people being deaf. But in fact, a lot of people who use North American hand talk, it wasn't so much about ability, right? And I think what you point to is really important in that it does create a lot of accessibility and communication, right? So we even know that like young people or like babies are not yet able to speak, but they can sign, right? Or older people or other people who are hard of hearing, it allows us to communicate to them as well. But I think it's important to clarify that that is not the only use for it. My husband in his dissertation, he talks about the ways that it would be really great to incorporate alongside language revitalization classes, the hand talk, right? So instead of like, when you don't quite know the word, reverting to English, then you can sign the word in another Indigenous language. And so we've tended to kind of keep them a little bit separate, but you know, in terms of my work, I offer, you know, I teach these practices at some of these at UCLA, and also I am able to do it in the community engaged research that I do as a form of reciprocity, right? So like, you know, what can I offer here? And in some cases, you know, the administrator has said, like, of the tribal juvenile hall, well, what would be useful in this case is yoga. So I think it can be, in answer to your question, it can be implemented on a lot of different levels and in a lot of different ways. I will say that I was really inspired by Akosia Red Elk, who we're bringing to use. I'm actually with the support of American Indian Studies at UCLA. She's going to come to UCLA to one of my classes next week, live via Zoom for the public. And she incorporates powwow dance with yoga. And I offered for one of Haley's gatherings, I was able to offer a class that did attempt to fuse North American hand talk and yoga.
Okay, that's a pretty good insight, just because been trying to do cultural revitalization with like learning the Karuk language of what I'm a part of and the tribe that I'm a part of. And I've been wanting to kind of implement sign language into it. So it was really intriguing to hear, like, I didn't even know about the hand talk in that sense. So I went and looked into it a little bit more. So that was really insightful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I would say, you know, I do a little bit of work on this, and certainly it is one of my research interests and something that I might be interested in pursuing more later down the line. But my husband would also, you know, if you email me, I can put you in touch with him as well, because this is really like the center of his expertise.
Okay, thank you. That would be awesome.
Welcome. You're welcome.
And I think Charlie said that there was a comment or question that he has from one of the audience members.
Yeah, actually, there's a couple, just since some time I messaged that, but one that is really good from Melody Lopez is working with families of missing and murdered Indigenous women / Indigenous people in the Southwest. Do you have any suggestions of incorporating body sovereignty into our outreach efforts in both urban and res communities? Because none of them do yoga.
That is, so first of all, you know, thank you for sharing that. That is really powerful and very important work. I would say that one way to approach this, especially when we're thinking about, so for instance, like we know just based on statistics that at least some or even many young people that are in the tribal or in, sorry, not tribal, but in a juvenile hall have experienced some sort of abuse, right? So we know that to be true. And so one thing that I would say is that when you have had some sort of abuse or trauma, it can be very challenging sometimes to do these embodied practices like yoga, because they can bring some of this up, right? And you know, we're sitting in we're in a position and there is discomfort. And one thing that yoga teaches us is it is powerful in that it teaches us to breathe through that discomfort. But sometimes that person doesn't want to be in that discomfort, or it's too much. They can't breathe through it. Right. And so in this case, what I would recommend is, this is not an area of my expertise, but I am sure that there is a lot of work out there that is around, trauma-informed approaches to teaching yoga. And I have even, we think about this, I've thought some about this in the tribal, doing work in the tribal juvenile hall, but also I've done work at Alameda County Juvenile Hall, in San Diego as well. So many different juvenile facilities over about the last 10 years. And there are some very specific grounded approaches we use. So for instance, a lot of yoga classes, if you go in a studio, people are in lines, right? But we practice in a circle. And of course that, that connects with, some Indigenous ways of understanding. And, but also, if you've experienced trauma or abuse, it feels very unsafe sometimes to bend over if there's someone behind you, right? So we make sure people are in a circle and that they have a wall behind them so that they feel safe. So those are, those are some examples of that. Sometimes, in some facilities that I've taught, students are required to attend the yoga class. And so I never force anyone to do anything. I say, please, you're welcome to just sit on your mat and relax and join us. Something else that might be very uncomfortable is like the closing of eyes, right? Because closing of eyes is a trust thing. I never ask people to get on their hands and knees, which can also feel really vulnerable. So yeah, I think yoga can have all sorts of powerful healing possibilities. And what's really important is thinking about, what are the adjustments that we need to make in order for people to feel safe so that they can heal from that trauma and not me as a teacher, not be perpetuating that trauma.
Nice. Hey, I had a question, sort of follow up, but maybe a little bit of a different direction. In your presentation, you talked about, studying dance movement to unearth knowledge, and you also talked about sort of sovereignty is embodied. And so I'm wondering, like, when you just for the audience to maybe connect the dots, like, what do you mean by that you can unearth knowledge from studying movement and dance? And then how is that, connected to sovereignty? Because I think both of those issues are very much important to our speaker series, and really talking about the importance of putting forth interventions and knowledge and practices from the root, from the foundation of indigenous epistemology. So just, yeah, your thoughts are on unpacking that a little bit more for our audience.
Good. Those are good questions. And, I have to say, like, I really appreciated being I did take some time to prepare for this, because a lot of times the way that I'm working is like close readings, right? So this is kind of a macro, I'm being asked like what the introduction to my book might look like. And so I feel like there were definitely challenges kind of thinking at this macro level, but certainly I'm going to be thinking more about your questions, but I'm also going to try to do my best to unpack what I mean. One example of the dance and movement unearthing knowledge is in the Buffalo Dance film. We and the Buffalo, especially the Buffalo Dance performance, by studying the movement, right, by looking at the signs. And then I'm not only in conversation with George Bluebird about this, but Dr. Lanny Reelbird as well. Oh, he would be a great person, Amada, for you to reach out to. He is an expert when it comes to North American hand talk. But he helped me, I had some idea of what most of the signs meant, and I wanted to check in with him and make sure that I'm getting those right. And so a lot of, people might not study closely each individual dancer and each individual movement to recognize that those are North American hand talk signs, right? And then once we have the signs, then we can say, okay, what do these signs mean? And then when we have these three signs in succession, what do these signs collectively mean? And what is the knowledge that they are communicating to us, right? That would be one example. Another example that I had the opportunity, and this is a very recent paper, probably within the last month or so, the HOZHO yoga one about the interconnections of humans and more than humans, and also mind, body, spirit. I was thinking about doing close readings of the body through an indigenous lens and a Dene tribally specific lens. So, okay, let me just try to ground that in example. One is, she is a Navajo woman practicing yoga on Navajo lands. When we see her in downward facing dog, yeah, you can see a dog in that. But when you see the butte in the same shape behind her, it makes us think, wow, so like here is the human form referencing the animal, the downward dog, also referencing the butte behind her. How are we supposed to think about that sort of interconnectedness, right? So that's a way of unearthing knowledge. When I looked at eagle pose, which I have on my slide because I thought that I might go into this, but the arms are crossed like this in eagle pose. The legs are also wound around one another. It looks in some ways like an eagle. There's the beak. But there's also, we can think about the ways that the legs are really wrapped. They look like snakes, or they look like vines. And I started thinking about, well, for the Dene, the corn is sacred. And so we can also think about a Three Sisters garden, right? And the Three Sisters Garden is not like it's balance. It talks about, you know, it's the connection. It shows us balance, right? Nutritionally, these plants are balanced. And then also like the way that they grow, where the squash spreads out and there's the corn stalk. And then because the bean can wrap around the corn, you know, then it, you know, instead of getting buried underneath the sprawling squash. So we can make it allows us to like consider and these possible multiple meanings. And through considering these possible multiple meanings, we can deepen our understandings, right? And then like in terms, I think of revitalization, I've heard, you know, Rulon Tangen, who is the choreographer for Indigenous, Dancing Earth, Indigenous Contemporary Dance. One thing she says about revitalization is we can go to the, you know, even if we don't have the practice, we could go to the land where the practice is from and take in, you know, learn, gain knowledge from that, right? Like looking at the land, looking at the animals that are indigenous to that area. All of, you know, all those more than humans have knowledge. You know, and I've also been thinking a little bit about, you know, my husband and his family and the way that they consider the possible meanings of dreams, right? And even, you know, what does the dream mean? What are the possible meanings? Even that is a way of like self-reflection and of growth. And, you know, doing this analysis, I earlier said, like doing the analysis of Haley Laughter's HOZHO yoga, it, you know, I think about like, okay, like really, and as a wrestler, you know this, like really breaking things down movement by movement. You know, what does it mean to be in plank pose? And where is your gaze? Where's your drishti? Where is your focus? It's on the earth, right? And then you sweep up into upward facing dog. And now you're looking, you know, you're looking at the, you know, parallel to the earth, right? And then, you know, there's a lot of movements in yoga where you look up at Father Sky, right? And so thinking about that, where's the gaze? Where's the intention? These are all ways of unearthing knowledge and growing and, you know, growing, I think, as human beings. And so, yeah. And, you know, there's also, I'd say one more thing is like, sometimes, you know, there's the sky, right? We see Father Sky, but then in yoga, your hand is, you're looking at your hand, right? So we can also see that human and not a more than human connection there.
That makes sense. And thank you. So where my, you know, question was coming from is really, you know, we here at Two Feathers are a nonprofit. And so we're working a lot with youth and trying to apply a lot of the knowledge and the theories from academics like yourself. And so, you know, we also earlier this week had Dr. Linda Smith and Dr. Kutcher Risling-Baldi and Dr. Rahami. And really, you know, they were looking at and talking about having, starting with the sort of trauma-informed care, but from a Maui perspective. And so I think so much of what we're trying to do at Two Feathers is to work towards, at the foundation, at the root level, an indigenous perspective and how to really teach so that youth and families can start to internalize that. Because what better way to sort of practice like survivance and empowerment and agency than to come from our own knowledge systems and our own belief systems. So being able to unpack different ways of, we didn't even think about that, that's indigenous, like yoga, that's indigenous. You know, and so that's where my question was coming from.
Yeah, no, I love the work that you're doing. I think it's really, really important. And yeah, I think it's great. And we should, as academics, I think as academics, we ethically have a responsibility to make sure that our work, you know, is thinking about like community and social justice. And so, yeah, I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
So I was going to turn it over to Charlie. He hasn't asked the question yet. He's our host.
Well, I just really appreciate the wisdom and passion that you're sharing with us through what you are an expert in. So I appreciate that. And speaking of trauma informed, Care, I have another comment from the comment section, and it's kind of in regards to allyship, and there's another comment that was mentioned, so I feel kind of enticed to ask this question, but I'm curious about the allyship question as well. I teach basic trauma-informed yoga for women at a residential recovery unit in New Mexico. We support a number of Native American clients. Do you have any suggestions in regards to allyship?
Yes. May I share? Would it be okay if I share my screen again?
Yeah, go for it.
Because I tried to prepare for that one.
Sure.
Okay, it might take me, before it was taking me a moment to find it. Let me see, I might have to get it up. Okay, let's see. If not, if it's too much trouble, I'll just answer the question. Okay, for some reason it's not coming up, so I'll just answer it, you know, kind of based on that slide. But yeah, I thought that, you know, I've been listening to the other presentations, and certainly as someone of Native ancestry, I think a lot about allyship and what that would look like, you know, and how I should be ethically engaging with Native people. And so the first thing I would say is that I think allyship is a praxis. So it's something that is continual. It doesn't end. It shouldn't end. It should be a lifelong praxis. And one of the first things I think about is how can I build respectful and reciprocal relationship with the people on whose land that I live and work. So I think that that's really important when it comes to Native protocols, is thinking about being in relationship with the people whose land that you benefit from being on every day. I think something else that is important is to defer to Native people and support Native voices, and to move forward and move back, right? So Native people are, you know, another thing that dance and Indigenous studies teaches us is that lived experiences are theory, lived experiences is knowledge. So Native people are experts, right? And there are a lot of times when we should be deferring to them and centering their voices and their perspectives. And at the same time, I think, you know, we wanna move forward and move back, right? Or maybe, I hadn't considered this, but maybe, you know, as a person with Native ancestry or non-Native person, sometimes we better move back before we move forward, right? Because maybe we're already forward. I think it's important in my particular case as someone with Native ancestry to be really clear about my positionality and the difference between ancestry, citizenship, and or community belonging, right? So the difference there is that tribes are nations, tribes have sovereignty. And so in that way, I'm not a Native person. Being ancestry is not the same thing as citizenship or having that community belonging. I think it's really important to use what privilege that you have to speak out as oppression and to speak out against oppression and support Native people and issues. So I feel like, you know, I'm still an untenured person. We still look at like women of color in the academy and mothers, and those tenure rates are pretty darn low. But I also have a lot of privilege. So how can I center Native voices, illuminate Native voices, bring you know, Native people to campus, right? In terms of yoga, you might think, you know, how could I not only teach Native people, but is there a way that I can help support training Native people as teachers, right? And again, I think, you know, be strategic. In my particular case, I really think about being an ally, being strategic and leveraging academic resources to support Native students and off-campus communities. So, you know, I'm proud to be writing research grants that provide honoraria to Native people, that you know, that I am running by Native people before I send in the grants. I'm asking for their permission. Being a grant writer is a great way to do that. Another way is to, again, center Native artists and experts. And it's really important. I mean, I think probably a lot of our audience knows this, but very often Native people are brought in and not necessarily given an honorarium or paid for their time and expertise. And so for me, that's really important to pay Native people. They have expertise. They also have to, probably get in their car or drive or prepare for the Zoom or whatever it is. And then finally, in terms of, I think those are pretty like general, and you could find those other places, but one thing I would like to add to that I've been thinking about that kind of connects with my yoga practice and other embodied practices is a sustained, being an ally, I think, is a sustained praxis of non-attachment. So I am not attached to the research questions. I am not attached to what this particular yoga class is going to look like. What I want to center there is how can we, and this is what community engaged research does as well, is how can we think about community well-being and of course, like this is Native practices or Native epistemologies, understanding the collective, but this can be very different from what non-Native people are taught.
I really appreciate that answer. I think it's very thorough, and you provided some really good examples. And I think the positionality of it is really important, especially as academians. I think when you think about the historical relationship of Western science and Western institutions, it's a make or break for me as a learner, as a student. And so I really appreciate how forward and how hard it is. I think it's really a touchy subject for a lot of people, but it is important nonetheless, and is very respectful. So I appreciate that as a person as well. And I'm not sure I think that was the last that I've seen from the comment section, and I'm not sure if any of my colleagues have any follow-up questions or thank yous and whatnot.
I see it's got a couple more minutes. So just want to throw it out there for any last comments, any things that you'd want to follow up on, or maybe even like what the direction you're going in your research going forward. I know you talked about a book, I think. So I just wanted to let the audience know we have a couple more minutes and have some last thoughts, comments, questions.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I have a book project. It's tentatively titled Native American Embodiment, Settler Colonial Choreography and Indigenous Resistance. It looks at the 4 sites I've been talking about on Lakota lands, which are a former boarding school on the Rosebud Reservation, a tribal juvenile hall on the reservation that's currently in operation, and 2 South Dakota state prisons, a men's and a women's prison. And so that's the book project. I would say that mostly the research for that project is done. So now it's really about writing up that project. But also, and I'm just going to say this because I was thinking about, I really appreciated one of the talks I saw where someone made a distinction between, I thought it was a great point, between being a community consultation and community engagement. And so that was also something I really thought was like generative to think through the work that I'm doing. What was I going to say with that? And so even though the research is done for that book project, I have still responsibilities to those communities that I work with, right? So even though I will need to be working, I'll also be like checking in with them. I'll be attending their gatherings. They ask me to do different things for them as well, which can be like a phone call or putting down tobacco or, different things like that I'm able to do with the privilege that I have as being a non-incarcerated person. And then I would say, the other thing that I'm doing right now, we are doing right now is, putting into practice and thinking about building relationships with the community whose land that I'm on, right? Like with the Tongva people, and in particular, Jessa and Tina Calderon. And yeah, so you know, we just received our first funding to create a gathering of representatives from 4 California Native nations to come together and talk about revitalizing and innovating their dances. And so with respect to tribal protocol, that would be closed to the public, but then there would be a public presentation in which the representatives would be, you know, sharing what they deem is appropriate to share. So yeah, thinking about, you know, what the work might look like after the book project, the relationships. And, you know, I will say also this really productive distinction between community engagement and community consultation. And I want to say this too, because you know, maybe some people who are watching who are in graduate school, the universities, which is also not a surprise, are really not set up for community engagement, right? Like if they were really set up for community engagement, we wouldn't be letting people into a PhD program who have like a proposal of the research that they want to do necessarily, right? We would be letting people in who have a bunch of questions or permission from like communities that they want to work with and questions that are important to that community. So this second book project, you know, gives me, I think, the opportunity to think about what does it mean to, from the very center, from the very beginning, be building reciprocal relationships and deferring to Native people, right? And really doing research with them.
Right on. Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us, and always, as always, thank you for sharing your time. I think that kind of wraps things up here. And so, yeah, thanks again for your time, and stay safe out there and have a good one. Two Feathers out.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.